Zdravstvuyte, tovarische. So, I thought we'd stick with distillates just a little longer and move on to, you can guess, vodka, which is a cousin actually of all the spirits that we have been discussing today. It just means, in Russian, vod means water, so vodka just means little water. So it's basically the same word as aqua vitae, water of life, eau de vie, whiskey. It's just another variation of that kind of water, a little water. Now, the irony of vodka is, despite the fact that legally it's not supposed to have any flavor or aroma, which means it's basically just a way of transferring alcohol from liquid state into your body, it is the most popular spirit on the market today, which obviously reflects the rise of the cocktail, because people are expecting to mix their vodka in with something else, right? It's not because vodka tastes good, it doesn't taste like anything. And although it can be, and certainly has been, consumed straight, it's really not something you drink because it tastes good. It doesn't. And like several other drinks we've been discussing, it also has some very, very strong nationalist associations. Predominantly, of course, with Russia, but you will see that Poland also has a claim on vodka. And of course, there are now vodkas that are distilled in Sweden and Finland and Iceland and lots of other places on Earth, especially through the Baltic and Northern Europe. So, as I've intimated through much of the course thus far, remember, vodka can be made of anything, right? It's almost any clear distillate today is actually called vodka, even if it's made of grapes or potatoes or some other thing. Now, unlike the spirits we have been discussing lately, what makes vodka strange and unique is that it's pretty cheap. It's really never been a luxury or status item. Despite recent attempts to have glamorous kind of makeovers for vodka, it's not something you can really charge a whole lot of money for. $20 is just about the upper limit. Now, there are a few that are a little more expensive than that, but it's not something that someone's going to spend a lot of money on because it's not aged. It has no character, right? So that's not to say that there aren't very clever marketing to consumers and who choose a specific vodka that they believe matches their personality or style of life or whatever it may be. And this includes now a slew of artisanal vodkas also, including ones that are organic and made on the prairie or by small, presumably small scale manufacturers, although, again, companies like Tito's are very, very large, although they claim to be craft. And it seems, sort of absurd to me on some level, because whether this is really an important matter for an alcohol to be called craft when it actually has no character, right? That's the whole idea behind vodka, is that it's neutral and flavorless. So does it really matter what it's made from or who makes it or whether they put their creative spirit into it? Doesn't really matter because it's just basically alcohol, right? So, but let's talk about it culturally. To start with, vodka is, in certain contexts, a beverage whose consumption is very highly ritualized, especially in Russia. And because of its price, it is also the one that is most abused or is drunk in extraordinary excess. Let's put it that way. At least that's the reputation of how Russians drink, is to they drink a whole lot of vodka, which is in fact true. And interestingly, people outside Russia definitely know about it, and to some extent, it was even exported to the West, especially from Poland, actually. There's a very interesting passage in one of my Renaissance era authors. This is Jean Brouillerin Champier. It's a book called De Re Kibaria, on things about food, written in 1560, in which he describes the various habits of people around the world. And a lot of it is hearsay. He, of course, hasn't been to these places, but this is like a sort of food encyclopedia of the 16th century. And he says that Muscovites and Lithuanians are given to intolerable drunkenness, and they do this presumably to counteract the cold, because it's a very cold place. But he says that they use grains which we would normally feed to horses, meaning oats and things like that, to make what he calls aqua ardentem, just as the French and Italians do from wine. They make an eau de vie. So he's clearly talking about vodka, and this is almost 500 years ago, which I think is kind of amazing that it's already a well-known product at that point, that a food historian, encyclopedists over in France would actually know about it, and although he doesn't say he's tasted it, he knows that they make it. Now let me talk just a little bit about the manufacturer. People generally think that the traditional way to make vodka is from potatoes, and that's actually not true at all. It's that really doesn't happen until the 19th century, early 19th century. Before that, long before potatoes arrive, and of course before potatoes are eaten commonly. Remember, because people kind of suspect potatoes as not being very good for you. So long before then, it is actually made from grain. So it's not different from the base of whiskey or anything like that. It can later be made of sugar beets, again, like 19th century, but it doesn't really matter. And the differences in taste when you distill something to that level, that in other words is distilled and distilled and distilled, so eventually it's just mostly alcohol. The differences in taste are very, very subtle. That it's really not important what you make it out of at all. Distillers outside of Eastern Europe have used corn. They use fruit, as in France, and I've even heard people distilling soybeans, using that as a base to make vodka. Which is, of course, we've got plenty of soybeans, and it's really, really cheap. But the point again of vodka is that you remove any and all flavor, aroma, and color. So that means repeated distilling, repeated filtering. You want a neutral product in the end that has no trace of what it's made of. Now, the strangest phenomenon, I should say, of the past decade is the prevalence of vodka that's been flavored, which basically just means, and it's actually very easy to do because many flavors are alcohol soluble. So if you say take a chili pepper and toss it in a bottle of vodka, the flavor will infuse throughout the whole thing, just through maceration. You don't have to heat it, you don't have to do anything. So you can throw in vanilla beans, you can throw in raspberries, you can put in apples, orange peels, or if you are unscrupulous, you can just throw in artificial flavorings. So strangely, it's actually very, very easy to make flavored vodka at home. You just throw the flavorings in. So I don't really understand why people would buy it, because it's a little more watered down than regular vodka, and you pay a little more for this artificial flavoring in water. So I need not comment, and I'm not going to really dwell on this because it makes me just angry to think about it, about the vodka that is flavored with chocolate or cupcakes or marshmallow or whipped cream, and God, I've even seen peanut butter and jelly flavored vodka. And these are obviously not infused. Okay, you can't take a peanut butter jelly sandwich, throw it in a bottle of vodka and expect it to be good. These are artificially flavored, and they're usually heavily sweetened. And I will not mince my words over these, lest you misunderstand my meaning. These are the sign of the end of times. This is the end of Western civilization as we know it, because artificially flavored vodka in sweet drinks is just about the most heinous thing I can think of on this planet. I mean, gastronomically and even ethically, the whole idea of feeding adults candy and cake in the form of alcohol infantilizes people's taste buds and makes them aesthetic morons. That's all I can say. And if you drink this stuff, I apologize for insulting you, but it's horrid. Enough. Done. Okay, so enough. Unlike the other spirits we've discussed, there is no national or even internationally recognized standard of quality in vodka. And this is a very important point. It can be literally complete garbage. And if you've ever bought, the stuff that comes in a plastic jug that's a gallon for $10, you will have experienced directly the effects of what that means, the lowest quality standards possible. Now, there are, of course, on the other scale, there are premium and super premium vodkas that claim to use only frozen Arctic water, hand cut from icebergs, or, that was frozen 10 million years ago. So these will be, of course, these types are a little more careful in removing any of the what's called fusel oils, Fusel. That means the nasty stuff that'll give you a hangover, basically, and what is called a congener, Congener. Those are the parts of the that come in the first distilling and the last distilling that will give you a headache and cause a hangover. But in terms of taste, the point again is not to preserve any essence of whatever this thing is made of. It's the point is to get rid of the taste entirely. And in fact, let me give you. I'm not just saying this to be facetious. The U.S. government defines vodka as this: neutral spirits so distilled or so treated after distillation with charcoal or other materials as to be without distinctive character, aroma, taste, or color. And following this dictate, much of the vodka in the United States is actually pure ethanol, industrially manufactured from grain, the cheapest grain they can find, by a company. But there are a few companies that do it. Archer Daniels Midland is the real big giant. And then what they do is they take this rough ethanol, and it's actually the same stuff that goes in your gas tank in California, and they sell it to companies that filter it and add water because you want it to be 40 proof, and so it's watered down, and then they package it under various labels. So it really is just watered down chemical alcohol. Okay, that's what they sell, and people mix it in drinks and things. So let's talk about the history. And all right, so the origins, at least the oldest recorded use of something that is pretty certainly vodka, is not Russian. It's Polish. It's from the Akta Grodzkie, which is a court document dating to 1405. And in this case, like everywhere else, the alcohol is a medicinal concoction. The distillation technology was definitely introduced from abroad, most likely by the Hanseatic merchants, because remember those Hanseatic merchants that were all through the Baltic and eventually make their way up through at that time was Lithuania. It's now Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and then ultimately to Russia, right? So they bring, and to Poland, of course. Poland comes first in that line of Hanseatic towns. So Gdansk, or what was then called Danzig. And then also, in the later centuries, it's the Dutch who come into that whole area, who had long commercial connections there. And that's probably the way the distillation technology gets there. Okay, and I've never actually read any historian say that outright, but I'm pretty sure that's how it gets there. Now, similar spirits, some kind of grain-based hooch, doesn't actually appear in the Cyrillic alphabet. You all know Russia uses a different alphabet than Poland, right? So this is Russian we're talking about. That doesn't happen until 1533. So it's over a century later that the Russians have it. And for a long time, it's very exclusively associated with Moscow and no other region. And that I can't explain, how they get it and why they have it there. But in any case, the timing is pretty much the same as every other distillate we've been talking about, right? And what is even weirder about it is they're making this stuff, but they don't have the word vodka. That doesn't become a widespread word in Russia until the 18th century. They definitely have something like vodka before that, but it seems like the Polish word vodka with a W does actually predate the Russian. So when you see Polish claims to that vodka is really a Polish drink, it's pretty historically accurate. Now, for the first few centuries, it really is Poland that's not only most associated with vodka, but the only place that produces it on a large scale and exports it. This comes from cities like Krakow in the south, Poznan, and as I mentioned, Gdansk, which is the north, and it's a German Hanseatic town in what's today Poland. And it appears that for much of the early modern period, it's really the Poles who are the real innovators for vodka. 1693, Jakub Kazimierz Hauer described how to make vodka out of rye rather than wheat. And it makes sense because rye grows a lot easier than wheat in this area. And it is also the Poles who introduced the potato vodka. When we get to the 19th century, potatoes are even cheaper. You don't have to tend them. You leave them in the ground and you just dig them up, and they ferment very easily. And it's even after Poland is partitioned. This is a long history, but in the 18th century, Poland is split between Prussia on one side, which is German, and Russia on the other side. And it's still, even though there's no state of Poland in the 18th century, it's still the bigger producer than other regions. Nonetheless, the persistent national association, whether through successful advertising or just by virtue of being the dominant empire in Eastern Europe, vodka gets associated with Russia. And there are very good reasons for this. Let me explain. In the Middle Ages, Russia was overrun by Mongols. Okay, they were conquered and ruled from the outside. They were overlords for many, many years through the Middle Ages. And there was not even really a state in Russia until Ivan the Great threw off the Mongols and became what was called the Grand Duke of all the Russias, which means all the regions within Russia. And his son, Ivan the Terrible, was crowned Tsar of Russia in 1547. So we really can't even talk about a country called Russia until that point. And the word Tsar, Tsar or Czar, comes, of course, from the word Caesar, Kaiser, right? In German, Caesar. In Latin, it means emperor. Okay, that's that. You might not have thought of that weird connection in Russian. And of course, as a state, they think, we have to raise money. We need a source of revenue in order to wage war. And Russia was, in this respect, no different from any other state. You, of course, tax people. And in order to tax them, you have to know who's making the stuff, right? And so if you have fewer manufacturers and larger ones, it's easier to collect the tax. And of course, it's most easy to tax them at the point of consumption if you can license the places where it's sold. So Ivan decided the way to do this, the efficient way to get the tax money, is to grant exclusive privileges to a class of nobles who were his favorites, people who were his buddies. He wanted to give them a sort of favor. These are called oprichniki, okay? People he granted land to, and as a favor, he said, I will give you a monopoly on the production of spirits. No one else is allowed to do it. So there are official taverns where people could buy the drink, and then the emperor can tax them officially. Okay? He doesn't want it being made all over the place. He wants a lot of it and to tax it, and to do that, he grants these special rights to the oprichniki. So, I think no one did more for the reputation of vodka than the Tsar Peter the Great. Okay? He was the first Tsar to actually westernize Russia in many ways. And he's looking, very interestingly, to the Dutch. He actually went there and studied and came home and shaved his beard off, which was scandalous for a Russian emperor. And reorganized the army according to Western standards, spread the fashion for Western art and architecture, and the city of St. Petersburg is a gloriously beautiful Western capital, facing the West, of course, not just physically, but sort of aesthetically. It is very, it's got these lovely canals going up and down, and very, very Western buildings, because they wanted to imitate ultimately Versailles. That was, the Louis XIV's palace back in Europe. So St. Petersburg is beautiful. Beautiful pastel colors on the buildings that are neoclassical. They don't look Russian for sure at all. So Peter the Great liked to ply ambassadors with vodka to get them drunk, and he was assuming that they would reveal state secrets. He was a prodigious drinker himself, and in 1695, he founded what is called the Drunken Council of Fools and Jesters, whose charge was to get drunk every day and never go to bed sober. Okay, why the emperor founded this, I'm not quite sure, but apparently they would dress up and perform skits and silly songs and wreak general havoc. And everyone knew the emperor was a drunk, okay? And in fact, he died at age 53, largely because of his riotous living habits, or at least that was the reputation. But vodka, I have to say, was still at this point, it was the end of the 17th century, was really not something most people drank regularly in Russia. It's not considered medicine, but it's not something that's cheap and ubiquitous and available everywhere. But this changed under his successor. This is Catherine the Great in the 18th century. For a handful of reasons. Catherine was also another great ruler, looking to the West, and by and large. She abolished the state monopoly and had manufacturers bid on a number of available licenses to distill vodka. She thought, let them compete against each other. And she thought, this is a much more sensible way to raise revenue. Let me give it to the wealthiest people who want to bid on this, and I'll get cash for the licenses, okay? Now, what she decided to do then is, if they're going to tax this, we want people to drink a lot of it, right? So we can get more revenue. So the price of vodka was fixed very low. Okay, this is still following mercantile principles of economics. And so the idea was if people produce a lot more of it, make it a popular drink, they will collect hefty fees from the producers who can afford it. And of course, they're making it on a much larger scale. So it just means more revenue for the state. Um, and the only problem here, and this is something that I should really just stop and explain for a moment, is that Russia, by this point, is very, very different from Western Europe in that they still actually have serfdom. You know, I mentioned this in context of the Dutch buying their grain in Eastern Europe. Well, what that means is that people are literally bound to the soil. They they have to work there. They serve a number of days on their lord, on the landowner's plot, and he keeps the produce and can sell it and do whatever. So it's essentially a medieval system of landowning that has fallen apart in the West, largely because in the wake of plague and other huge sort of world events. But in Eastern Europe, serfdom is still the rule of landholding, which means they're forced to work on farms. They're also they live at subsistence level, unlike the West, where we're about to see the agricultural revolution in the 18th century, where the production rises, the cities grow, population grows. In East, it's a low population, it's rural, it's very backwards, and they are literally living hand to mouth. In other words, whatever they grow, they eat, and if the crop fails, they're out of it. So this is not market-driven agriculture. It's not a place either where luxury goods are going to find a market, right? If you're talking about England or France or the Netherlands, then luxury goods there are enough wealthy people that they can support these kind of luxury goods. But economically, this is not a place where an industry in luxury goods is going to flourish. Even though the Tsars, you know, I have to say the very amazing thing, you know, Catherine's Winter Palace is among the most beautiful things I've ever seen. But she was the only person with wealth. That's the point, is the wealth of the country all went to the rulers. A handful of people who surrounded her in court and nobles, but, you know, 99.9% of the people lived in abject poverty. And so it's not the kind of place where industry is going to flourish, and certainly not in luxury goods, you know, like alcohol. So the net effect is that the producers of vodka made it with the lowest possible standards. They used the worst materials, grain that probably wasn't fit to eat, and then they sold it as cheaply as they possibly could. And I think to some extent it makes sense that the populace, generally under the thrall of serfdom, is kind of prone more to a kind of fast and feast mentality. They're not going to be like in the West, where the ideal is to have measured consumption, and you have a glass of wine with dinner or a drink or whatever, and you know do that every day basically. Here, it's whenever you have the money, you splurge, you get blind, stinking drunk, and then you you don't have any money, so you stop on other days. So it's a kind of fast and feast idea, which is very much like in the Middle Ages everywhere. But here, of course, the idea is to drink not only to drown your sorrows, you know, because you're in poverty, but because if you can't get your hands on drink, you know, very often, you're not just going to take a little nip. When you can afford it, you're going to drink a lot of it, okay? So in other words, I think the reason vodka turns out, from the very start, in fact, to be rot gut, and why it becomes socially acceptable in Russia to become very inebriated. In other words, that's an acceptable state of being. I think it has everything to do with the fact that this is the material basis of the society, exists with vast gulfs of inequality, right? And an economy that still is profoundly medieval, even into the 19th century. And so the drinking tends to be binge drinking, okay? And it happens on holidays, you know, rites of passages, marriages, baptisms, the feast of the local saint, whatever it may be. So I want us to listen to a tune when we're in class, but this is a folk tune in Russia that I think will give you a sense of the place of vodka in the society. Okay, it's about a Cossack leader. You know, Cossacks are these soldiers that wear these long cassock. The word Cossack comes from that. It's just a big long coat. And this is the leader of them in the 17th century. His name is Stanka Razin. Okay, And he was known for these fits of rage whenever he got drunk. Okay, and Cossacks, of course, rape and pillage and terrorize the countryside. And when they have an opportunity, they get blind, stinking drunk and go berserk. Okay, so let me read this. I'll read you the words here now, and then we'll listen to the song when we get to class. So, from beyond the island to the wide plain of the river waves, sail painted, arrow-breasted ships. So they ply up and down the Volga. On the first one, Stenka Razin is sitting with a princess in his arms. He is celebrating his new marriage. He is merry and drunken. So he's been given this woman as a present, and she's his princess, and he's getting drunk, celebrating it. And behind them, there is a murmur to be heard. These are all the other tough Cossacks around him when he sees this hero coddling this beautiful young woman. There's a murmur to be heard. He has exchanged us for his wife. He was only one night together with her, and in the morning he's become a woman himself. He's become weak because of the influence of this woman. This murmur and this jeering comes to the ears of grim Ataman. With his mighty arm, he circled the body of the Persian princess. She's Persian, actually, because you remember Volga goes down to the Middle East, basically. Grabs this Persian princess. His black eyebrows came together, and like a rising thunderstorm, impetuous blood came rushing into the eyes of the Ataman. This is Stenka himself, the ruler, the head of the Cossacks. I will give everything and won't regret it. I'll even give my tempestuous head. His mighty voice sounds across the riverbanks. And she, with downcast eyes, more dead than alive, remember she's been given as a present, silently listens to the drunken words of the Ataman. Volga, Volga, dear mother, Volga, you Russian river, you have not seen a present from a Cossack of the Don. That no discord may arise among freeborn men, Volga, Volga, dear mother, on account of a beautiful woman, take her. With mighty energy, he lifts the beautiful princess high and throws her overboard into the approaching waves. Why do you devils hang down your heads? Filka, come dance. Let us sing, brothers, an audacious song in memory of her soul. And so from beyond the river, to the wide plain of the river waves, sail the painted ships of Stenka Razin. He sacrifices her for the sake of solidarity among the Cossacks. Okay, so it's just a bizarre story, right? that they all think he's gonna go soft. He says, "Fine, fuck it," and throws her in the water. It's amazing. Okay, this is a Russian folk song. Okay, that's widely celebrated. So, in any case, into the 19th century, let me give you some external accounts of Russian drunkenness. So a visitor from the United States says this about them. Okay, goes there, and this is still the empire, right? Drunkenness is the great vice of the people. I saw more drunken men in Russia than I have seen in any part of continental Europe. Not a day passed without painful exhibitions of men in almost every station of life, meaning rich, poor, who are intoxicated or helplessly drunk. The people love strong liquors, and the lower class drink a villainous, fiery liquor they call vodka, which is worse than a torchlight procession going down the throat, meaning it burns. It's like fire. Another one said that before 10 in the morning, he found a drunken 12-year-old boy who had joined the peasants in drinking themselves into a beastly state of intoxication. So people who go and visit Russia in this period generally say, I can't believe how drunk everyone is. And even the most cursory look at the literature of this era reveals that drunkenness is a recurrent theme going through Russian literature entirely. For example, if you look at the great novel Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, that's 1866. The book was originally entitled The Drunkards, and it features this young woman named Sonia, whose father is an alcoholic, and she has to prostitute herself to feed the family, her younger brothers and sisters. That's the basis of the whole story. Turgenev in Virgin Soil in 1877 wrote this: everything sleeps in Russia. In the village and the city, officers, soldiers, merchants, judges, fathers, children, all are asleep. Only the drink shop sleeps not, saturating holy Russia with drink. I'll give you another example. Anton Chekhov, the playwright, depicts the peasants in the village of Zhukovo. On Elijah's day, they drank. On the Feast of the Assumption, they drank. On Holy Cross Day, they drank. The Feast of the Intercession was the parish holiday for Zhukova, and the villagers seized the chance to drink for 3 days. Now, obviously, these are all fictional accounts, right? But I think they would not have struck a chord with their audience and with Russians in general unless there wasn't a kind of measure of truth in it. And of course, these people are ultimately complaining about the fact that everyone is sodden with cheap vodka. And, you know, obviously, if they're critical of it, they're bound to exaggerate. I don't want to suggest that this is an exact reflection of the truth, but by all accounts, everyone who shows up there who are Russian or from the outside says Imperial Russia was awash in vodka. And in general, the kind of, let me use the term, misanthropic view of the world, hating everyone, that's sort of so deeply bound into Russian culture and society that and I think it really does have a lot to do with vodka. You know, it's that you're drinking swill, okay? And I think there's probably no better example of all this than Tolstoy, his book Resurrection. It's actually one of my favorite novels. It's 1899. It's a novel about the hypocrisy of the church, on the state promoting this alcoholic stupor, and against the penal system that basically punishes innocent people after they commit crimes out of desperation. So it ends up really being, it's a weird novel in that it ends up being deeply religious. But Tolstoy was also an anarchist. He believed that if you just got rid of government was the root of all problems. And of course, the government in this case was, right? They're the ones who promoted the cheap vodka in the first place. It's strangely, it's his least popular novel, I guess. But very powerful, very bleak. And Tolstoy, you know, apart from being an anarchist, was in the end of his life advocated prohibition. So this is, you know, late 19th century, the whole move toward prohibition. It's not just an American thing. It happens around the world. Let me give you this little excerpt from a letter Tolstoy wrote. In all that I have been writing this past year on social questions, I have been expressing as best I can the thought that the chief evil from which mankind suffers and the disorders of life come from the activities of government. One of the striking illustrations of this is that the government not only permits, but encourages the manufacture and distribution of the poisonous evil of liquor, the sale of which, from which the sale comes 1/3 of the state budget. I don't know if that's true, but it sounds like it. In my opinion, if the government really was making every effort for the good of the people, then the first step should be the complete prohibition of the poison which destroys both the physical and the spiritual well-being of millions of people. Okay? So he's saying it's very simple. Just get rid of the alcohol and people will not be in a desperate stupor all the time. Now, I think the state sort of looked at these complaints and they said, well, you're right, but on the one hand, they couldn't like turn a blind eye to this widespread alcoholism, but they also couldn't abandon the revenues that they got from vast quantities of vodka because they taxed it efficiently. There's a very interesting book by Patricia Herlihy, which is called Alcoholic Empire, and it argues that vodka was integral, if not the defining feature of 19th century Russian society. Workers were sometimes paid in vodka. It was easier just to hand it to them directly. And to such an extent that there was a law in 1886 that officially prohibited paying in vodka, but I guess people did it anyway. And at one point, late in the 19th century, they put money into clinics and popular entertainment, and they said, we're going to sponsor these moves for sobriety. It's called the Guardianship of Public Sobriety, and they thought this will be a way to divert people from drink. We'll have kind of it's sort of public relations. You know, we'll throw a campaign to lead people away from drink, and obviously there's a ridiculous internal contradiction of having, on the one hand, encouraging liquor sales and keeping the vodka really cheap, and on the other, having this sort of public service message to try and get people to be sober. You know, it reminds me sort of like, you know, our government um, saying don't eat. The nutritional guidelines come out and they say don't eat processed fats and sugars and all this, junk food basically, and yet we subsidize the corn and the soy that goes into the junk food. So we're doing one thing with one hand and telling people to do something else with the other. It's exactly the same here. And it's exactly the same reason we do that. Is it's we get votes and supporting the farmers means Middle America supports candidates for it. So the lobbyists keep our farm bill very strong for that reason. This is exactly the same thing. Is the government really want they're telling everyone don't drink so much, it's terrible, but we need the revenue from drinking, so keep going on and drinking. Nonetheless, vodka, I've given you this impression maybe that it's just a drink for the poor. It's not. Wealthy people serve vodka at a gathering that's kind of ritualized. It's called zakuski, okay, Zakuski, and it's something like a smorgasbord. You put out delicate little foods on a buffet table that would include, let's say, pickles and cucumbers and pickled herring. So this is all stuff that can be cold, right? Sometimes ham or tongue, cured meats, things like that. And bread and butter is the basis for the whole thing. Some savory pastries, and of course caviar, which is the pride of Russian gastronomy. And pretty much, looking at this, I could say these are pretty much the best things in the world. Okay, they're in terms of foods. They're all marvelous. And with all of this, you have a little chilled glass of vodka. You do not sip vodka. You know that. You just knock it back. Okay. And it is actually very rude to refuse a drink if you visit someone's house. They will offer you vodka cold, and you will make a toast, for example, and you have to drink. Okay, it's part of the whole ritual of the thing, and what is interesting again is that there are no class associations with vodka. Now, why? If you look at the shape of this society, there are no real classes, right? There's a couple of wealthy people, the very, very top. Everyone else is poor. So unlike the West, where we have very specific class associations with particular drinks and with types of drinks and with brands even, and in Eastern Europe, I won't say it's a classless society. It's just a tiny bit of rich people and the poor people, and so there really isn't a distinction of diet or a drink based on class. The wealthy have more, and they have slightly better stuff. Of course, they can afford the really good caviar. The poor people have the junk, but there are not like the associations that we saw with gin and cognac, very much class based. Here, vodka, everyone drinks it, and it's all bad. Okay, so and it's probably why the move toward prohibition was so strong also in Russia, just as it was exact same time as it is in the U.S. Now, what happens, of course, let me give you a very brief history lesson here, is Imperial Russia toppled right at the same time that the prohibition thing was gaining steam, and it's not surprising that the leaders of this revolution, who are profoundly influenced by Marx, right? The idea that there would be a natural progression of different types of economy, and that eventually the workers would rise up and steal or take over the factories, right, and dispossess their bosses. They saw alcoholism as a byproduct of capitalism, right? They thought, of course, this is in a society where money and profit for the few is the goal. Well, of course, they're going to sell cheap alcohol, and everyone's going to be drunk, and that's why we have alcoholism. So, at least theoretically, what they were thinking is that the workers, of course, drink because they're desperate, right? They are mere appendages of flesh on machines of iron, as Marx would have put it. And of course, they have no recourse to anything but intoxicants to make their miserable lives bearable, because their work is basically just, working for a boss in a factory and producing goods that they have no creative input in thinking about and no creativity involved, and they're not craftsmen at all anymore. They're workers in a factory. Okay, and the idea, and this all of course comes from Marx, is that when industrial labor is alienated, mostly because workers really don't find any creative, meaningful expression in their work. They're just obeying orders, pulling a lever on a machine, whatever it may be. Um, but most importantly, because the factory owners own the means of production. They don't own the machines anymore, or the building, or anything. All they really own is their own labor, and they can only just sell that. Okay, and all they're really getting is wages, right? They're not getting any pleasure out of making the product itself. And of course, the dire squalor that they were forced to live in as a result of this capitalist setup meant that they live in poverty, and of course they will turn to intoxicants, right? What else is there to delude them but religion? Remember, Marx also said religion is the opiate of the masses, right? But the fact is, when we look at this situation, when Lenin and Trotsky and all these other revolutionaries took up Marxism, is that there was no industry in Russia. This is not a place the revolution should have happened. It should have happened in England, the most industrialized nation at the time. It should have happened maybe in Germany in the Ruhr Valley, maybe in northern Italy, which is industrial, maybe in Belgium and northern France. But Russia was still medieval. It still was peasant society, right? It makes no sense, according to Marxist theory, that it would happen there because there are no factories, there's no workers, there's no alienation of labor. These are still peasants, basically, in the fields. So Marxism doesn't really make any sense there. So in any case, what does this have to do with vodka? He's just going on about the Russian Revolution. The point is that Lenin said we need to ban vodka. It is clearly, a byproduct of the capitalist society, and when capitalism falls, so will its intoxicants, because people will then own the factories themselves, and we will become a state of the people, right? So now, partly why he did this is he was figuring the Red Army was actually very hungry, needed grain, and the grain that would have gone into vodka production, he wanted that to make bread. Okay, so and there was a very long, bloody civil war in the wake of the revolution. But I think it was also fundamentally ideological. Okay, it was this, he really didn't. He thought alcohol wouldn't be necessary in a state that was owned by the people who were doing the work. Okay, so once the war was over, of course, people wanted their vodka back. Okay. And they realized that this was only a desperate measure to raise money. So this is from a completely pragmatic perspective, ironically, what happens is that industrial methods of production were introduced, right, by Stalin. And Stalin said, I don't care what I have to do, I'm going to turn this into an industrial nation, because the theory says it has to be industrial and the workers have to own the factories and means of production. So Russia industrialized very, very quickly. The state also took over all production of vodka. And it was geared entirely toward generating a profit for the state. So ironically, they're doing exactly the same thing that was done under Imperial Russia. And vodka was integral to these, what are called the 5-year plans. These are, jumps to try and get Russia to be industrial and compete with the West. And so the more vodka that could be cranked out and consumed by the workers, the richer the state became, and the drunker, of course, the workers became. So, to add to all of this, Stalin himself was a really, really heavy drinker. So let me give you I want to quote from this for no good reason. I just like it's one of my favorite novels. So this is Mikhail Bulgakov. It's called The Master and Margarita. If you have never read it, do. It's a wonderful novel. It's absolutely crazy and hilarious. It's written between 1928 and 1940. So this is in Soviet Russia. It's a story about a visit by Satan to the literary world of Moscow in the 1930s. And Satan comes with a couple of sidekicks, a choir master, a black cat with a gun named Behemoth, a hitman with fangs named Azazello, and this beautiful woman named Margarita who gets superpowers. So it's absolutely insane and hilarious. But in any case, let me read you a little scene out of this. So Margarita, the woman, asks, "Is that vodka?" And the cat speaks, incidentally, jumps up in his seat with indignation. And he says, "I beg pardon, my queen," he rasped. would I ever allow myself to offer vodka to a lady? This, ma'am, is pure alcohol. So he doesn't even, it's not even watered down. It's not, it's just, so anyway, it's crazy and jug soaked and very funny if you want to read something. So anyway, they clink glasses, and suddenly she feels like she's awoken from a long sleep and feels revived. And it's magic, okay? And the alcohol plays an absolutely central role in this whole novel. Whenever people drink, they are refreshed and their powers revive and they become human again. And the cat drinks alcohol through the whole thing, which is even more hilarious. And if you've ever, apart from the fact you might know the song is referred to probably in the Rolling Stones in "Sympathy for the Devil." People say it's about the novel. I'm not sure if that's true, but it's certainly about the devil. Okay, so in any case, another novel. This is 1969, called "Moscow to the End of the Line." It's by Benedikt Yerofeyev. It's about a guy on the train who intends to meet his girlfriend with flowers and candy in a place called Petushki. And he ends up stopping repeatedly. Every time the train stops, he gets off and has a drink and gets some alcohol. And he starts having these conversations with people every time he gets back on. And then eventually he runs out of money, so he starts drinking eau de cologne, and then varnish, and then shoe polish. And then it's one long drinking bout, and the whole thing is a satire of the Soviet state. Very, very funny book. And I think there's a movie made about it also, which is funny. So in any case, I think what is fascinating is the Russians have always made these furtive attempts to curb drinking. In other words, the government steps in and they say, we have to do something about the drinking problem. So there was a movement in the 80s, actually, by Gorbachev. You remember him? This is, before the Soviet Union collapsed. Gorbachev had a volunteer temperance society, and they had parties, official events, and things, all of which, of course, were alcohol-free. And he decided that he would limit the hours of operation for liquor stores, and he thought this is going to make people drink less. People hated it. Of course, they stocked up whenever the stores were open, and it failed miserably. And what is interesting is that when the Soviet Union fell apart, the most ironic part of this whole story is that capitalist enterprise, of course, boomed. Some people got perversely wealthy in Russia based on this. And investments in vodka suddenly went through the roof. So you now will see, in a way that it was rare before, you'll see lots of different Russian vodkas on the shelves everywhere, even in Stockton. You can find Ruski Standard, which is, I saw the factory of that actually outside of St. Petersburg. But, Stolichna is everywhere, and even really cheap, crappy Russian vodka you can find in the United States fairly easily. But of course, marketing means that the image of vodka was very different in the US, right? It's not exactly the same thing as it was back in Russia. And this, of course, goes back before the fall of the Soviet Union. It actually even goes back before the fall of the Imperial Russia. A Russian emigre, Rudolf Kunet, introduced what was called Smirnoff to the United States. This is right after Prohibition was lifted. And the name itself was actually purchased by purchased from a descendant of the Russian Pyotr Smirnov, an actual person named Smirnov, who used to supply the imperial court and had devised this special system of filtration. This is the charcoal filtration that takes out all the impurities and flavor and everything. So Smirnov, when it came to this country, had no real connection to the Russian one. It was another company. He bought the name, basically, and presumably used the same technique that they did in Russia. It was, the factory was in Connecticut, okay, very small operation actually, and it was purchased by a bigger company called Hubline. They were then bought by Diageo, which is one of the real monsters of the spirits industry today. And that's actually, I should just say, this is a pattern that happens in spirits right down today. It is conglomeration, big companies buying little ones. It's vertical integration, meaning that a company will buy the bottling, they'll do the marketing, they'll do the distribution, they'll run the whole company, right? So if you had a small business, you really can't muscle in. They control everything. And so what happens is, from that point through the 20th century right to today, a few companies basically own everything. Okay, so let me give you an example. Diageo owns not just Smirnoff, but also Johnny Walker and Guinness. Uh, Pernod Ricard is the second largest. They own Absolute Vodka and Ballantines and Seagram's and Beefeater Gin. Number three, and these might be outdated actually. This is a couple of years old. They may have bought and sold since I wrote these notes. Number three is Bacardi, who owns Dewar's, Bombay Sapphire, and Grey Goose. So these are all not separate companies. They're owned by much bigger spirits uh, super companies. Number four, Brown Forman owns Jack Daniels, Finlandia, Jimador Tequila. So you can see how what they do is every one of these companies wants one major brand of every kind of spirit, and they buy them, or and whatever. So in any case, why am I mentioning all this conglomeration? It's because huge companies like this can afford enormous marketing efforts. They can brand, they can advertise, they can find out exactly who their consumers might be, and this really changes the whole industry in the 20th century. Smirnoff vodka becomes prevalent brand in the US, and people actually only drink vodka in the US because of their great advertising. And of course, there's a theme I've been trying to draw out of everything is if you tell people about something and build an image, you can get them to drink it. And perversely, it is the weirdest thing is that the consumption of vodka rises in the US in exact opposite proportion to that sentiment against Russia was rising in the United States. During the whole Cold War, that's when we started drinking vodka, the drink of our supposed enemies, which is so bizarre to me. Now how they did that is really a fascinating story, and I want to talk about this in greater detail when we get to class, because you'll recall that in 1962, a particular fictional character was pictured drinking a vodka martini that was shaken and not stirred. You all know who I'm talking about, right? The film is Dr. No. The character is James Bond. So if you want to build an image of sophistication and debonair, know-how, you have them drink vodka. Now why, I don't know, because it's completely flavorless again, but it is what really saves vodka, and what makes it the drink of choice down the road is that it is cocktail culture, right? I mean, that's cocktail culture rises in the 50s and 60s and then sort of stems off 70s and 80s, but it's on the rise again today. So and it is really the only spirit that can be mixed with anything, because again, it's a neutral flavor. If you mix brandy with things, it's going to taste like brandy. If you mix bourbon, even, they make great drinks, but you wouldn't mix bourbon with like juice or something. Vodka you can, soda, and you can throw anything into vodka, and it's perfect. Coffee, you can put vodka in coffee. So the interesting thing is another factor in this whole mess is that during the 70s, during détente, this is when we were trying to be nicer to Russia, President Nixon thought, let's do something symbolically to ease the tensions between our two countries, between the Soviet Union and the US. And so he struck a deal that the Russians would allow Pepsi Cola to be manufactured in Russia and sold there, and we would allow Stolichnaya to be sold in the US. And that's why Stolichnaya was the only Russian brand really you could find for a long, long time. And it is really, truly terrible vodka. It's just it's one of the worst, and it's always been, it's fairly expensive, but it's strangely, it's really not very good. So, as with other spirits, as you know, the past decade or so has seen premium brands proliferate. At first, a slew of expensive, supposedly higher quality vodkas that are made with better ingredients and methods, but I think more important than the contents is the bottles are what were really sold vodka. It's the design of these bottles that literally came out of nowhere. Sweden, a Swedish vodka company. And remember, vodka is not native to Sweden, right? The Swedes had schnapps and various clear distilled alcohols, but usually they flavor them with caraway, so you get aquavit in most of Scandinavia, which is beautiful. They said, why are we trying to sell this weird spirit that we love and no one else does? Let's just call it vodka. Make it clear. Take all the flavor out. So that's basically what they did. And Sweden jumps into the fray with a vodka that literally changes the whole landscape of vodka consumption. This, you know, is called Absolut. Um, and and their advertising campaigns were and still are really astounding, but it was really the bottle itself. This clear bottle that had this beautiful design, looked iconic and looked iced and chilled and refreshing, and people thought this is a clean vodka. And I don't want any of these old-fashioned spirits that are brown and that are going to make me fat, or I don't know what it was, but it was this perception that somehow vodka was cleaner and purer and cold and refreshing and could mix with things, and the perception, although not the reality, the perception that it was actually less lighter, you know, would be better for your body somehow because it didn't have the brown coloring and heaviness of other and flavor of other things, and the manufacturers played on that, you know, that whole perception of it being light and hip. And so what happened is the other brands just sort of imitated Absolut directly. So Finland jumps in, the Dutch come in with Kettle One and Van Gogh, the Danes have Danska, Iceland has Reykja. So the Poles, of course, who've been making vodka all the time, you know, suddenly said, well, why aren't we marketing this? This is after the fall of Soviet Union, of course. They say we need to market our own vodka elsewhere, so they come out with Belvedere, which is a beautiful bottle, and Viborova and a whole bunch of others. And then the weirdest thing of all, of course, is out of nowhere, a country that has never made vodka, has never had anything to do with it. The French come out with Ciroc, which is based on grapes, remember? And Grey Goose. Grey Goose does remarkably well, you know, sort of passes all sorts of taste tests, and what a taste test for vodka can be, I have no idea, because it all tastes like nothing. But I guess it's, you know, it's doesn't taste awful. Like, it tastes like nothing. That's an advantage, I suppose. And then, of course, you know, there are American brands that play on this also. Hanger One, which is made right here in Alameda, and it is actually made from grapes, I think. Tito's, which is the you know, one made in Texas, which claims to be craft. Sky Vodka, that's another American one. And of course the you know, small artisanal manufacturers all have their own micro distilled versions. I mentioned the organic Prairie vodka, which has become popular, and there's also an eco-friendly vodka called Death's Door. Okay, so that doesn't seem like a good name for a vodka, but in any case, these are all pretty much the same, you know, and I think they're sold in bottles that look the same, and none of them taste much like anything anyway, so it hardly matters. But I want you to again think of the image that these conjure up and what they look like in the advertisements. They're supposed to be clean, refreshing, cold, light in calories, even though they're really not. All alcohol has the same calories. Young, hip, sophisticated, and most important, something women can drink. Okay, not filling, not ponderous. So think about that. And we'll look at some vodka ads and some copy about how vodka becomes the most popular alcohol in the U.S. See you next time.